No, I'm happy to be here. Let me suggest, first of all, that we take at least a few minutes to quieten our mind as much as we can manage. Krishna repeatedly says in the Bhagavad Gita that he's seated in our heart, in our mind, and in our body. If we don't simply dismiss this, how do we take a few moments at least to connect with this subtle spiritual energy being labeled Krishna? Now, I would invite everybody to take a few minutes to slightly quieten our mind. As I was just saying, Krishna says several times in the Bhagavad Gita that he's seated in our body, in our mind, in our heart. So it's not to imagine some person playing a flute who is Krishna. It's the divine spiritual energy pervading the whole cosmos. In fact, repeatedly Krishna also says in the Bhagavad Gita, all there is Krishna, that this is understood by very few people with a clear mind. So let's take just a few moments, and then what actually helps to quieten the mind is to connect this with your breath. We have a natural tendency to say my breath or your breath. I did not create myself. I would have no idea how to create this breath or this breathing apparatus. Even the Bible actually says it's the breath of God that is keeping me alive. If you're interested, you can read this in the book of Genesis. It's the divine breath that is keeping you alive, keeping me alive. And when that breath leaves, the so-called Ravi will die. So pay a little attention to your breath. And as far as I can determine, in all ancient languages, the word for breath and for spirit is either exactly the same or very close to each other. So breath is actually the expression of the spirit in us. So pay a little attention to your breath, but don't hold it inside or outside. But simply paying attention naturally changes the quality of your breathing. I had said earlier, because we have only a limited amount of time, I will use some slides. All right, so let me, first of all, my own impression is, obviously on these matters not everybody agrees. Personally, from my understanding, the Bhagavad Gita is the single most important text to emerge from India. And many people outside India as well as within India probably would agree with me. Here is a remark of Aldous Huxley. The Bhagavad Gita is one of the most clear and comprehensive summaries of perennial philosophy ever revealed. Hence, its enduring value is subject not only to India, but to all of humanity. And the dating of this text, of course, the scholars naturally is part of our job to argue with each other. Otherwise, we'll lose our jobs if we don't do this. so the scholars keep arguing. The dating of this varies from 500 BCE to 150 BCE. And then one of the Spanish scholars, Juan Mascaro, made this very interesting remarks. He said, scholars differ as to the date of the Bhagavad Gita, but as the roots of this great poem are in eternity, the date of its revelation in time is of little spiritual significance. So we don't need to worry when it was actually written or revealed. I suspect most of you already know the general background of it, so I will be very quick about it. A battle has become inevitable. This is the Bhagavad Gita is one of the books in the Mahabharata, the great text Mahabharata, and the battle has become inevitable. But I should also say, whether this was actually a historical battle or a mythological one, it's not entirely agreed on by people. But in any case, in general, the emphasis in the Bhagavad Gita itself is, or according to all the sages in India, that the battle is really between our own lower ordinary egotistic self and the great self that is identically the same as Brahma, which is the label for the highest reality. But in order to convey something from one generation to the next, usually, how can I say to my 4-year granddaughter that this is an inner battle? So then it becomes externalized. So don't take this battle completely externally. This is a battle within ourselves. And both Krishna and Arjuna are also in us. This will be an important thing to keep emphasizing again and again. But in any case, now the battle has become inevitable, and Duryodhana, who is here, representing one side, Arjuna representing the other side, they are going to all the neighboring kings to ask for their help. In general, only two people in the whole Mahabharata are aware of Krishna's real nature. The others just think of him as a usual ordinary king in the neighborhood. Because to know the real nature of somebody else, one needs to know one's own real nature. Otherwise, it's not easy to find the real nature of somebody else. So only two people in the whole of the Mahabharata are aware of his real nature. Duryodhana is not specially aware of this, and nor is Arjuna. On the other hand, Arjuna has a great respect for Krishna for varieties of reasons. I don't want to go into the details of it now. It'll take me a lot of time. So they both go there thinking of him as a standard ordinary king around and asking for his armies, etc., to help them in the battle. But Arjuna naturally, as a kind of a respectful for him, stands in front of him with his folded hands, and Duryodhana is sitting on a chair nearby. So Krishna first sees Arjuna and offers him this choice. One side can have all his armies, chariots, bugles, weapons, horses, elephants, and the other side can have only him. And in this particular battle, he would not carry any weapons. Now, what would a reasonable person choose in a case like this? In any case, Arjuna had the first choice, although this itself keeps varying a little bit. Some scholars actually wonder if Arjuna had the first choice or Duryodhana had the first choice. But in general, Arjuna had the first choice and he chooses Krishna. And Duryodhana is delighted because he's happy to have all the armies and the weapons, etc. So then, since Krishna is not going to fight, what is he going to do in the battle? So Arjuna asks him to become his charioteer and asks him to take him in the middle of the armies to see who he has to fight. Here is a representation of the armies on both sides. And when Arjuna realizes that he has to fight his own cousins, his own teachers, he has a crisis of conscience. And he basically says that my heart is troubled and I cannot fight. So he leaves his bow and arrow and steps down from the chariot and appeals to Krishna for help. And this is his remark. And the first chapter in the Bhagavad Gita is mostly dealing with the big image of the battle. So description in terms of weapons, bugles, chariots, etc. But from afterwards, there is not any particular reference to the Bible or to the battle. Occasionally, Krishna still says, therefore fight. But the rest of the whole Bhagavad Gita would be relevant for any other situation. For example, if there were some writers gathered together in a library having a crisis of writing about something, Krishna would not then say, therefore fight. He would say, therefore write. The rest of the Bhagavad Gita is all exactly the same for everybody. So here, this is Arjuna's crisis. My very being is afflicted with the flaw of pity and weakness of spirit. My mind is bewildered about dharma. I will come back to this word in a moment. I ask you, tell me decisively which is better. I am your pupil, for I have taken refuge in you. Teach me. I think crisis in one's life is almost a necessity to face something deeper in oneself. Otherwise, one usually just lives at the usual level. There is no call to connect with something deeper or to search for something deeper. And the word dharma, in fact, it's the very first word in the Bhagavad Gita. And it's very difficult to actually give one word English translation of it. It can mean obligation, responsibility, duty, law, order. It can also mean a teaching. For example, Buddhism in Sanskrit is called Bodh Dharma, Dharma of the Buddha. That means teaching of the Buddha. It can also mean what is one's essential nature. For example, actually in the Mahabharata, there is a story in which a serpent is being killed and his wife wants to save him. She says he's just performing his dharma. His dharma is to spread poison. So dharma has many, many meanings, and it is impossible to translate this by one word in English. But in general, one could say, well, as I have said here, it means so many things here. As a phrase, we could say dharma is the responsibility for the maintenance of order. Now, Arjuna has a crisis of dharma. What is the right action for him to undertake? And then Krishna's response generally is, first of all, to point out that there are many levels of dharma. He has a family dharma. Of course, according to family dharma, he should not be killing his own cousins or his teachers or uncles. But there can be a larger dharma. For a very simple example, a CEO of a company may discover that what his company is producing is harmful for the planet. But his responsibility is to maintain the price of the shareholders. So now he has a crisis to stop using these chemicals because they are damaging the planet. So question then is he going to stay with the dharma related to the shareholders, or is he going to go to dharma corresponding to taking care of the planet Earth? So therefore, basically, Krishna's response, one could say that dharma has to do with what is the right action in any given situation. And essentially, Krishna says that no action can be right until the actor is right. And in order to become the right actor, first of all, what is the right actor? The right actor has clear perception and knows the one thing that is needful. Then there is no conflict, no decision making, no choice. Because to have a choice means there is a lack of clarity. It's strange because the contemporary usage of this expression, oh, I am so free, I have a choice to do X, Y, Z. But this remark of Krishnamurti is helpful. As long as you have a choice, you're not free. Christ did not have a choice. The Buddha did not have a choice. Choice really means that I'm not clear what I need to do, the one thing that I need to do. So this is the right actor from Krishna's point of view. Here I just want to point out that Krishna actually says that to become the right actor, he has to practice yoga. And the main yoga that Krishna teaches is Buddhi yoga. Ironically, hardly any of the yoga teachers even seem to mention this. For example, Iyengar or Deshikachar, as if this doesn't exist. I will show you, give you precise references where Krishna repeatedly says this is the main yoga he's teaching, Buddhi yoga. I had actually written a paper published by the Cambridge University Press in 1979 in which I tried to point this out. And there was much academic interest, but not at the level of people teaching yoga. Then in 2006, I discovered a book written by a well-known great sage in India, Shri Anirvan, called Buddhi Yoga in the Bhagavad Gita. Here is the title of this. And this article that I just mentioned, published in the Cambridge University Press, is in this book, The Spiritual Roots of Yoga. So it is not that people are not, nobody is aware of this, but it doesn't seem to get mentioned in a general people who are teaching yoga here, there. Mostly what is being taught in the name of yoga is really how to increase your sex appeal, as far as I can see. That's what gets called yoga. Um, but here, let me repeat this again here. The main yoga that Krishna teaches is Buddhi yoga, the yoga of awareness. Here is one example. Actually, he says this 3 times in the Bhagavad Gita. In the beginning, which is in the second chapter, is when his teaching begins in the second chapter. Last chapter is the 18th chapter. There also he says, and the middle is the 10th chapter. So I'll just quote this to you right now. This is in the second chapter. What has been declared to you, O Arjuna, is the theoretical wisdom. Now listen to Buddhi Yoga. When you are disciplined with it, you will be free from the bondage of action. And here is in chapter 10, to those who are constantly disciplined and who adore me with love, I give Buddhi Yoga by which they come to me. Then, last chapter, devote yourself fully to me as the Supreme, renounce all your actions consciously to me, take refuge in Buddhi Yoga, be always one with me in heart and mind. So how could anybody say that he's not teaching the main yoga as the Buddhi Yoga? But here, let me also mention that it is not easy to translate the word Buddhi. For example, in my book on the Bhagavad Gita, that some of you may have read this, I have a whole 1-page long footnote giving different meanings of this word Buddhi. But it can be more or less understood as awareness or integrated intelligence, conscious attention or understanding, or intelligence beyond thought, the way Krishnamurti would use that expression, or the way Guruji would refer to this as the higher mind. It is also translated as soul by a well-known, actually an English scholar, Zainer. He translated the Bhagavad Gita and he translates Buddhi as the soul. Buddhi, which constitutes the subtlest and the highest faculty in human beings, is not translated easily. Buddhi has the same root as the word Buddha, meaning to wake up, to become aware. So, therefore, I recommend to you to just keep the word Buddhi rather than trying to translate this. So, here is a remark of Krishna. The senses are great, they say, but manas is above the senses and Buddhi is above manas. Both, sometimes in English translation, both Buddhi and manas get translated as mind. But let me remind you that even in early Greek literature, you have 2 different words, dianoia, which is the usual mind, and nous, N-O-U-S, as the subtler or higher mind. So manas is really more or less like the usual analytical mind. In fact, more than once in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna includes manas among the senses, because that is more or less justifying whatever the body either fears or desires. And so here is the remark then to keep in mind. Manas is above the senses and Buddhi is above manas. And above Buddhi is the embodied one. He doesn't even call it Atma or anything like this, but whatever has taken on my body to make it alive. So obviously we might call it Atma or spirit or soul, but Krishna basically just calls it the embodied one. The Sanskrit word is Dehi. Thus, having known that which is higher than Buddhi, sustaining the self by the self, slay the enemy, O Arjuna, which has the form of desire and which is difficult to conquer. This is the remark of Sri Anirvan, who I think I just showed earlier the big front cover of his book called Buddhi Yoga and Bhagavad. That was published in 2006. So I was not aware of this until much later. He initially actually wrote this in 1981 in Bengali, which was his mother tongue. but it was translated into English only in 2006. So Buddhi has both a psychological and a cosmic aspect. The relation between the two in spiritual realization being that between a means and an end. A very simple example I often give: if I'm driving in a car, at least in Canada, many times you see a sign saying, nice lookout. So you can then stop there and you look on the other side and you can see, for example, snow on the mountains or lovely valley or whatever, but you are still on this side. So Buddhi is the possibility from where, although I am on this side, I can see something on the other side. So Buddhi is personal. Your Buddhi is different from my Buddhi, but it can be aware of something transpersonal, something cosmic. This is why Sri Anirvan says Buddhi has both a psychological and a cosmic aspect. Just like a nice lookout on a road. Here is the right order that is recommended, and this is the usual order. So the right order is Dehin, which is the embodied one, whichever the element of the spirit that has taken on by body, more or less informing or speaking to the Buddhi, then controlling manas, then controlling the body. There are two words in Sanskrit which are both translated as body. I have given their English words here, English translations here. Deh or sharir. And the wrong order is in the obvious opposite direction. So body is controlling the mind, and the mind sometimes tries to control even the Buddhi. In fact, a very strong expression in the Bhagavad Gita that if the Buddhi is destroyed, everything is destroyed. Buddhi nashat pranashyati. So it's a very strong emphasis. So fulfilling dharma requires yoga, but Krishna says that yoga cannot be accomplished without yajna. This word in North India is pronounced as yajna, often in South India as yajna. So, but this is the way it gets written in English. And Krishna very much emphasizes the importance of this. This world is not for one who does not practice yajna. How then any other world, O best of the Kurus? So yajna is close to the original meaning of sacrifice, which, as you know, comes from two Latin words, sacer plus facer, to make sacred. Nothing can be sacred unless it relates higher than our usual level. So, but every sacred undertaking is yajna, because what this word sacrifice may not convey, although very strongly emphasized, for example, the Rig Veda actually says yajna is the navel of the cosmos. Every spiritual teaching has to do with a form of sacrifice of one kind or sacrificing my attachment to my usual self to be able to connect with something subtler or higher. But what one forgets in the word sacrifice, that certainly in the understanding of the word yajna in Sanskrit, there is a kind of a mutual nourishment. I am nourished by the devas or by the angels, and the devas are nourished by me, by my work or by my practice. So here you can see this here. In the beginning, this is a remark of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, in the beginning, Prajapati, the Lord of creatures, created all creatures with yajna and said, by yajna, may you multiply and may yajna be the source of your abundance. By yajna, may you nourish the devas and may the devas nourish you. Thus nourishing each other, you will attain the supreme good, nourished by yajna. The devas will bestow upon you the joys you cherish. One who enjoys what the devas give but does not give anything in return is verily a thief. The all-pervading Brahma is established in yajna. So yajna is really more or less like any spiritual practice is yajna. Let me remind you of this, not to get wholly imagining that to simply translate this as sacrifice. Every spiritual practice becomes yajna. Here, in fact, I say that here. Then Krishna even says there are some who practice yajna by offering their material goods, others who undertake austere efforts and practice of yoga as yajna. And for still others with serious vows, yajna consists of self-inquiry and sacred knowledge. This is something very important to keep emphasizing. Nothing can be practiced or achieved by any searcher without having an impartial and deep self-inquiry. Because I need to see what in me wishes something, what stands in my way, what interferes. And of course, in the process, one would also see that I have a devil in me. Everybody has a devil in one. And this can be very frightening to people, which is why the reason is to recommend that it is good to work with other fellow searchers. Because then one soon begins to discover that what is deep down true for me is true for every human being. The devil or Satan is also son of God. He didn't create himself. Nobody ever got to enlightenment or to heaven without being tested by the devil. Look at any of the prophets in the Bible, or look at the Buddha being tested by Mara. So Buddhi Yoga basically is not against any of the other standard yogas. It is in fact like a conductor in an orchestra. Sometimes invites flutes, sometimes strings, sometimes drums. So one cannot always be undertaking action, which is what karma yoga is about. One is not always going to be reading sacred books, which is what jnana yoga ends up being. One can't always sit in meditation, which is dhyana yoga, or one cannot always be adoring something or loving something. So Buddhi yoga is really a way of connecting the right proportions of all of these other yogas, bringing an integrated intelligence or an awareness. And it's useful to look at some of these remarks of Krishna about yoga. This yoga is not for one who eats too much or sleeps too much, O Arjuna, nor for one who gives up sleep or food. Yoga destroys the sorrow of the one whose sleep and waking, food and play, and actions are all disciplined. Very strong suggestion, not any kind of an excessive austerity or excessively putting one's body into all kinds of torture. In fact, Krishna even says those who undertake severe austerities torment not only themselves, they torment me who is seated in their body. This is in the 17th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. I may not show it. Then, when the mind is wholly under control and stands still in the self, when no desirable thing causes the heart to crave it, then it is said one is in yoga. So one needs to understand what is yoga aiming at, or what is the true partly being in yoga. Just as in a windless place, the flame of a lamp does not flicker, so is the mind of a yogi who practices union with the self. One who is satisfied with sacred knowledge and discernment, who is unwavering, integrated, and who has conquered the senses, is called a yogi. For such a one, a lump of clay, a stone, or a piece of gold are alike. One who is impartial to lover, friend, and foe, who is neutral among enemies and kinsmen, and equal-minded to the saint and the sinner, excels. You have a right only to action, never to its fruit. Do not let your motive be the fruits of action, but do not be attached to inaction, O Dhananjaya. Do your work established in yoga and abandon attachment. Be impartial to success or failure, for yoga is equanimity. Offering all your actions to me, mindful of your deepest self, without expectation, without self-occupation, struggle without agitation. Again, you see the emphasis on Buddhi Yoga. Actions are far inferior to Buddhi Yoga, O Dhananjaya. Seek refuge in awareness or Buddhi. Those who are motivated by results are pitiful. One who is in Buddhi Yoga leaves behind both good and evil deeds. Yoga is skill in action. Therefore, strive for yoga. So, Krishna never advising inaction, but the call always, this is actually also in the call of Christ in the book, especially in John's Gospel, very strong call that it should not be my action or my wishing to conquer something or to achieve something. Can my action be according to the will of Krishna? So the action is being done in me or by me or through me, but it is not my action. This is really repeatedly said by all the great spiritual teachers. But on the other hand, nothing against action. Yoga is skill in action, for example, is a very strong remark. One who does my work and has me as the supreme object, who is devoted to me and is free from attachment and is without enmity to any being, such a one comes to me, O Pandava, and exceedingly dear to me are those devotees who, full of Shraddha, carry out the eternal dharma described here and make me their one supreme aim. I just want to make one remark here. The word Shraddha in English translations almost always gets translated as faith. But this Shraddha has many different implications in it. Also, for example, confidence, trust. It's not faith in the sense that the word faith is used, for example, in the Bible repeatedly by St. Paul, or by saying that faith is the heart of the religion. We have to have faith in Christ as the only begotten Son of God. It's not that kind of faith that is being promoted here by the word Shraddha. It's so, but it is difficult to find one word translation of this important Sanskrit word. This is the reason why in my translation of the Bhagavad Gita, at the back I have given some of the key Sanskrit words and try to say, come back to the original Sanskrit word itself, not get stuck with one English translation of this. But again and again, a reminder that without Krishna, the battle cannot be won, but without Arjuna, it will not be won. Life is struggle, and none of us has a choice about participating in the battle of life. The real question is how to be a good warrior engaged in the battle and at the same time to discover and connect with the Krishna deep within ourselves, one who is above the battle. Really, the call in this spiritual teaching is to discover both Arjuna and Krishna within me. I am in the world. I need to undertake action, whatever action is considered right at that time by me, the right action. Not to be against the world or against the action, but at the same time to see something in me that is above the world, above the battle. So to find both Krishna and Arjuna. This is why this is actually almost the last remark in the Bhagavad Gita itself. Here I quote this here. This is my firm conviction that wherever Krishna, the master of yoga, is, and Arjuna, the archer, there will surely be splendor, victory, prosperity, and righteousness. Without Krishna, it cannot be done, but without Arjuna, it will not be done. So it's important to keep, how do I find both Krishna and Arjuna in me? And I suggest this as a simple exercise to everybody who is interested. Arjuna in me, really basically, Arjuna was regarded as the most skillful warrior. So whatever your profession is, whatever your activity is, whatever you are skillful at, that is your Arjuna. And then whenever there is any kind of a crisis, what do you, in yourself, what do you wish to connect with? Where do you search for some deep understanding? That is your Krishna. And in both cases, naturally more and more development of becoming more and more skillful in action, as Krishna says, that's real karma yoga. And at the same time to be remaining always above the battle. Engaged in the battle, but above the battle. The word Krishna actually has two different roots in Sanskrit. It'll be helpful for me to mention it. Krishna literally can mean dark. And generally in the Western tradition, dark is associated with something bad or evil, and white is associated with something good. In India, it's the other way, not completely the other way around, but in general, the suggestion is that every growth of any, let's say any plant, takes place in the dark. And if you look at the ocean, this top layer, surface layer is visible, but the depth is not visible. So the dark there is referring to more mysterious depth. This is why Krishna is shown as the Dark Lord. Arjuna, literally the word Arjuna actually means pale or white. So here is really a dialogue between the surface self and the deepest self, between Arjuna and Krishna. And the surface self is having a particular crisis, therefore he can turn to deep down what is in him, representing Krishna. So it is important to try to discover one's own Krishna and one's own Arjuna, because the call from the spiritual perspective is that both of them are in us. Another thing I should mention here, there is a very strong tendency, actually practically in all religions, to say, I love God or I love Krishna. This word which is used for love in Sanskrit in the Bhagavad Gita is bhakti. First of all, this word bhakti does not appear in the Bhagavad Gita until the last shloka in the 6th chapter. Before that, Krishna is very much emphasizing the right action, karma yoga, and right understanding or right knowledge, jnana yoga. Because to imagine that I love God just is a fantasy until I have the right action and the right understanding in me. And more troubles have been created by people claiming to love God. In the history of the whole world, religions are fighting with each other because they each love their own God. And also the word bhakti has a very built-in hierarchy in it. Arjuna can have bhakti for Krishna, but it is never used that Krishna has bhakti for Arjuna. Bhakti has very much a sense of devotion in it, submission, devotion, celebration. So bhakti is not only love, but it often gets translated as love simply like a standard love. And I'm just alerting you to be a little careful about this. On the other hand, it is true. Krishna actually says repeatedly that what is more important is for people to be loved by Krishna. Same thing is said actually by Christ in the Bible. Let me repeat, maybe a remark of Christ will be helpful here. Christ actually said, those who love me need to carry out my commandments. Then I will love them and will reveal myself to them. Or I will dwell in them as the Father dwells in me. This is repeatedly said by Christ in the Gospel of John, what I just quoted to you. Similarly, Bhagavad Gita Krishna repeatedly says, who is loved by me? And the one he loves is the one to whom he can deliver his teaching and assist him. So it is much more important that we are loved by Krishna rather than that we love him. And here is a remark of Krishna here. Devote yourself truly to me as the Supreme and renounce all your actions consciously to me. Take refuge in Buddhi Yoga. Sorry. Be always one with me in heart and mind. And then he actually also says that the end of many births, a wise person comes to me, realizing that all there is Krishna. Such a person is a great soul, but very rare. All there is Krishna. That's the call in everything. This is just showing, if you have any questions about anything in what I'm saying, you can write to me at this. This is my email address here. And there are many articles on my website, which is simply ravindra.ca or www.ravindra.ca. And this was just my last book published a few months back, in which I'm surprised how many mysterious forces have been helping me in my life. But I can't go into the details of this now. So first of all, I'm going to stop this screening of these slides unless there is some particular slide anybody wants me to focus on. Raja Yoga became an expression actually used initially by Vivekananda, literally meaning royal yoga. And that was initially very much emphasizing meditation. But if you read, one can use this expression, but if you read any standard texts of yoga, Bhagavad Gita is one of them, the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali is another one, you don't come across this word, Raja Yoga. So that's one thing. And secondly, you don't come across any particular posture. They are not against postures. In fact, asana, which will be translated as posture, I often remind people that not to take posture as only a physical posture, we also have intellectual and emotional postures. So asana is a much deeper idea than simply having a physical posture. But in any case, neither the Bhagavad Gita nor Patanjali's Yoga Sutra mention any particular posture. And none of them no serious teacher can possibly be against having a healthy, good body. Certainly Patanjali is hardly against that. So therefore, a healthy, good body is required, but that's not the main occupation of yoga. Yoga, actually explicitly described by Patanjali. Let me actually, if you don't mind, I quote 2 or 3 remarks of Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras. In the second sutra, in the second chapter, this is what is said. Yoga is for cultivating samadhi and for diminishing the kleshas. Klesha means obstacles, what stands in our way. So we need to diminish them. And the main klesha in the whole of the Indian tradition is avidya, ignorance. So that's the main klesha, main obstacle, although other obstacles are mentioned by Patanjali. But then what is the aim? To cultivate samadhi. What is samadhi? This description is given in the 3rd sutra of the 3rd chapter by Patanjali. You can happily look at it. Called samadhi is swarup shunya, meaning freedom from myself. That is what is yoga about, freedom from myself. Every serious teacher has repeatedly emphasized this, that I need to be free of me, me, me. For example, Christ says in the Gospel of Matthew, unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of mine. And you can read a similar remark of Rumi or any of the sages. So call really is, how can I be free of me, me, me? Then I can relate with something sacred. That's what yoga is about. So then I can relate with Krishna at the level that he is. Otherwise, I'm just stuck with me, my own aggrandizement, my achievement, etc. So, therefore, coming back to your question here about yoga is not against any of the physical postures. A good body is required, good mind is required. But what is this body and mind for? It's only here for a few decades, then it disappears. I keep reminding people, all my friends, between today and a year from now, more than 100 million people will die on this planet. Just like you and me. They're not different. 100 million every second. You can count how many will die every second. It's like a big conveyor belt. And as many will be born. In fact, more may be born. So, therefore, yoga really is how do I connect with the truth or with the real, represented by Krishna in this particular text. But it doesn't have to be labeled that. The suggestion there is that I need to pay for this nourishment, and that I pay for it by undertaking yajna, meaning if I remain attached to my ordinary self, that is, how can I connect with something sacred? So sacrifice there really is, yajna would be the right translation, would be sacrifice there, that I need to become free of what I am now attached to be able to connect with the devas. This is how I pay back. In fact, a very strong suggestion in a very ancient text in India called Shatapath Brahmana, older than any of the Upanishads. There it says that right at birth, a person owes debts, debt to the devas, debt to the ancestors, debt to the society, debt to the parents. So right at birth, we owe these debts. So in order to pay for this, I need to undertake what would be considered a sacred action. That sacred action, almost by definition, requires some freedom from my usual self. This is after Krishna says, whenever dharma is declining and whenever the opposite of dharma is increasing, I descend on the planet to help. So this is where then I was, if you just look around at the world, really almost at any time, right now, this book was written a few years back, but situation at that time also, but it's easy to look at the present situations, all kinds of terrible things going on in the world. What is happening in Gaza? What is happening in Ukraine? And then people arguing with each other whether we should help them or not help them. And I'm sometimes completely amazed that Krishna is not thinking that situation is bad enough for him to come down now to assist. That's how it came about, really, that remark of mine. I was struck by really the sad situation on the planet. And since then, it seems to me it has gotten worse rather than better. This book was published in 2017 and was actually being written a year or two before that. So it's almost 8 or 9 years back when I made that remark for myself. And now just look at the world. Thousands of children are being killed. And people are even wondering whether we should send them money or not, help them in any way. Besides, on the other hand, it is also true that whatever amount of help is sent, that is not going to easily stop the killing of all this. Damage that is taking place will sadly continue in Gaza because anybody who objects to that is considered an anti-Jews or something like that, which is amazing to me. I imagine you know that Jean de Salzman was my teacher, the person with the greatest, subtlest combination of wisdom and compassion that I encountered in my life was Madame de Salzman, Jean de Salzman. And one of her remarks, which is very much related with what you said, In fact, the thing which had specially attracted me to the whole of the Gurdjieff teaching, especially coming from India, there is a very strong tendency there to say, especially one of our old well-known philosophers, Shankara, makes this remark, Brahma Satya Jagat Mithya, so that the whole world is just illusion, and one needs to go to the Brahma Lok, meaning go beyond manifestation to Brahma. Personally, for me, that kind of understanding has done a great deal of harm to the whole of the Indian society. They don't take care of this world. And what attracted me very much about the Gurdjieff teaching was that both the planet Earth needs our action, the quality of consciousness on the planet needs to be developed, and we need to play our role for that. But that doesn't mean that there is not the other world. I always feel that both heaven and earth are our parents. Both parents need to be honored rather than just one parent. And here, since you have mentioned her name, maybe I will quote to you a remark of hers, which is actually quoted in my book, Heart Without Measure, which is when I was trying to write about what I heard from her, the only title that came to my mind was Heart Without Measure, because she carried an enormous amount of love. And on one occasion, I was specially struck by my own vanity. You'll have to take my word for it. I used to be more vain than I am. But I also realized that it is just a waste of energy, that I actually gain nothing from this. So I asked her, how can I be free of it? And I was very surprised by her response. She said, if you can actually read this in Heart Without Measure. She said, if you did not have vanity, what will you do? Because everything that we do comes from our own ego. And then when the ego sees something more sacred or real, then it does not take ownership. Then she makes this remark, ego is a good servant, but a bad master, which is more or less what you earlier ended up saying yourself in a slightly different phraseology. Ego is a good servant. Who wants a servant just lying around doing nothing? But if the servant begins to make all the decisions in the household, that's where the problem comes. So her remark, ego is a good servant but a bad master, is very significant from my point of view. Ego, by the way, this is another problem, how the word ego has, especially from the beginning of the 20th century, it has been reduced its meaning completely to ego, complete selfishness. Ego literally simply means self. It comes from Latin and Greek. All the great expressions of Christ, for example, where he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, they all begin with the word ego, ego eimi. This is how they all begin. So ego has now been reduced to complete selfishness, but it can also be completely selfless. Ego simply means self. One doesn't need to get so occupied with just the bad part of it. But it is true that one can become very egotistic, self-centered. But none of you would be able to participate even in this webinar unless you could pay for something or the other. How would you do this without having the ego having earned something or being in a place where you can live properly, find time to do something, to read something? So I am always completely surprised by people being against the ego. Do you think I would be invited to give this talk unless I had written some books? And how could I have written them without having a strong ego? Right. So I think it is completely silly to be against the ego. But it is true, on the other hand, that if ego completely takes over, then I am unable to hear something subtler than myself, higher than myself. So ego is a good servant, but a bad master. I find this a very helpful remark, actually. I almost end up quoting it to myself practically every day as a reminder. Not to get wholly stuck with the ego, but nothing could possibly be done by you or me in ordinary life in the world without the ego. And
Thank
ego
you.
really means the self. You can look it up in the dictionary. But it is true, particularly with the works of Freud and Jung, ego has been associated with just the lowest level of the self, psychologically. Actually, something which has always both engaged me and slightly even surprises me, that in the Upanishads, there is almost a suggestion that if anybody wishes to awaken in the world, the spiritual forces will come to oppose him, or they would send somebody to seduce him or do something so that he doesn't awaken. As if the ordinary universe is meant to be just a turning wheel, earning and spending, eating and excreting, being born and dying, as if that's the whole project. And it is easy for us to see this with regard to other creatures. You look at mosquitoes. Do they have a purpose in life? Are human beings just like mosquitoes? Why not? It seems as if the universe is just generally at a level of, as I just said, being born and dying, like a large conveyor belt. But on the other hand, it is true that throughout human history, not at only in one place, but in many, many places, some people are awakening, or they wonder, why does the universe exist, or why do they exist? And then occasionally, some of them come to a very clear understanding. And people around them can hardly believe that this person is an ordinary human being. So they insist on calling them half God, half man, or son of God, or God incarnate, because they can't just be ordinary person. And then the trouble is, very soon an organization gets organized around them, appealing to the masses. Now, just to remind you, at present you have 3 billion, no, not 3 billion. Actually, almost 3 billion Christians in the world. Are they actually following the teaching of Christ? Putin is also a Christian. Trump is also a Christian. So we need to sort of see that these labels can mean nothing. On the other hand, in the Christian history, you find some extraordinarily great sages who absolutely went completely free of themselves and were even able to sacrifice themselves for the sake of the world, or were able to connect with something true and real. Same thing in every other religion. In fact, the moment a religion gets organized, in my judgment, it does more harm to spiritual search than any other institution does. They just want you to believe something, to follow something, rather than to search for something. So, in a way, the situation in the world has almost always been like this. You can go back 1,000 years. Kings around are hitting each other, killing each other, using their women to sleep with them. That's what all the kings were doing in Europe. That's what they were doing in India or China, everywhere else. The trouble is now we have larger weapons. We can kill more people than they were killing earlier. Just the population in the last 100 years, you probably know that, has more than doubled on the planet. Much more than doubled. So more people can be killed, stronger weapons. That is true. But throughout human history, that has been the overall attitude. Look at any history in Europe or India or China, anywhere, Africa, neighboring kings just conquering each other, sending armies, usually even if you read the old so-called Old Testament, where to destroy the plants or the earth in such a way that nothing will grow there for decades. This is the call. Can you believe this? I just find it hard to believe that this is coming from the religious side. But if we actually face this honestly, then one sees that the fundamental requirement is how to move away within myself from the mass level understanding or mass level attitude, which is basically to do with how much can I earn, how can I be more important, etc. So freedom from me, this is again and again repeatedly said by all the sages. I can happily quote to you from Christ saying this, the Buddha saying this. In the Indian tradition, it's repeatedly said in the Upanishads or before the Upanishads. Again, or Bhagavad Gita Krishna repeatedly says this also. Only those can come to me who are free of themselves. So that is really the actual call, but it is easier said than actually practiced. I mean, what you're saying, just looking at the world, yeah, sure, it's a sad situation, which is why I keep asking Krishna, what is he waiting for? Why doesn't he come? And, as you know, advice is easier than practice, but still it can be helpful. So I would happily at least speak about your question. I think what helps, at least sometimes helps me, are repeated reminders. For example, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna repeatedly says, all there is Krishna. Similarly, remark that ultimately God created the whole world and God is omnipresent. If it is true, God is right here in front of you, and behind you, around you, inside you. So every creature has a particle of divinity in him or her. So just to remind myself of that, at least occasionally frees me from being mad or angry at somebody or critical of somebody. That, of course, the particle of divinity is in each one of us, otherwise we can't even be alive. After all, you or I did not create ourselves. It's obvious, right? I would not even know how to create my nails. How can I create this breathing apparatus, which is so complicated? So, therefore, a reminder that everybody who exists has the possibility, or not the possibility, the actuality of a divine breath in them or divine particle in them. Then sometimes one is able to forgive them, but also this is a very strong call. Actually, you know the Lord's Prayer in the Christian tradition, asking God to forgive us as we forgive those who trespass against us. It's a very interesting call, actually, in my judgment. So, but how to practice forgiveness is assisted if I can remind myself that they could not have created themselves without the divine particle in them. Sometimes we call it soul in everybody, and similarly in me. So can I look at somebody, listen to them from soul to soul, at least momentarily, rather than from Ravi to XYZ? That, I think, that reminder, I at least occasionally find it very helpful, that they too have been created by God, not by themselves. Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody.